I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. Tonight we're starting off with a look at journalism in Oregon, specifically nonprofit journalism that tries to cover stories that the rest of us miss or just can't get to. I think it's an exciting development, a pushback against all the stories of gloom and doom relating to the profession that I love. And it's our big story tonight. We've decided to take a decent amount of time to talk about this because, well, we love journalists in Oregon, and there's been a lot of loss of journalists in Oregon. So we're going to spend some time paying attention to that. The Oregonian's Mike Rogaway published a chart this summer that really has the depressing news. It highlights the demise of newspaper jobs. This is for all Oregon newspapers. They're on the far left. That's 2001, when there were a total of 4,747 jobs at the papers. Now, look to the far right, 2023, 1,122 jobs. You've probably noticed it with your favorite paper. No matter where you live in Oregon, there are fewer reporters, fewer stories. The TV business so far has not had the same type of drain, but audience habits are shifting for us as well, and the number of you watching us generally is going down over time. But tonight, we're going to focus on the papers. In an effort to fight the brain drain, the owner of Willamette Week is launching a new nonprofit news operation. They're calling it the Oregon Journalism Project. It'll be run by Willamette Week's Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Nigel Jaquist, and they are going to ask philanthropists to pay for it. I had a chance to ask Nigel about that recently.
We've been very clear with people that we would like to have their money, but there can be no strings attached. And I think that if anybody who knows Willamette Week knows that we will go after any story without fear or favor, and that many of the people that we have written about over the years have been people that we might philosophically agree with or agree with their politics, but when they need to be held accountable, we have held them accountable. So I don't have any concern. I think we've shown over and over again that we will, if there's a story there, we'll go after it no matter who it involves.
Like to hear that. It's normal these days for nonprofit newsrooms, by the way, to ask for donations to fund their work. We'll get into that more in a bit. Oregon Journalism Project will launch this fall. Jaquist says it's a direct answer to the lack of reporters statewide. We've
seen across the board, you know, in Salem, in Eugene, in Portland, in Medford, Pendleton, Ontario, every newspaper and news organization is much smaller than it was 10 years ago and vastly smaller than it was 20 years ago. That's no slight to any of those publications, including the Oregonian, which continues to do great work, but it's undeniable that even the Oregonian, which remains the state's largest newsroom, is far smaller than it once was. And that's not their fault. It's the industry that we're in. It's the migration of advertising from old methods to the internet, which has cost us all significant revenue. So this isn't about somebody else doing a bad job. It's about the loss of capacity across the state in every county, in every city, and are wanting to provide some kind of a watchdog service to shed light on things that should be better, that should be more accountable.
Now, another famous investigative reporter in Oregon is Les Zeitz. He owns the Malheur Enterprise newspaper. He's a two-time Pulitzer finalist and five-time winner of Oregon's top investigative reporting award. So he knows his business, and he's worked on huge stories at the Oregonians for 25 years. He agrees there are still many stories to find and tell.
Well, the short answer is yes. I think that's true, probably even in Portland. Well, the short answer is yes. I think that's true. Probably even in Portland, there aren't as many reporters as there used to be. So there are stories going untold in Oregon's largest city. But the principle then ought to be, how do we best use what journalistic resources there are in Oregon to tell the most important stories for the most people? Now, in Southern Oregon, on the coast, in Eastern Oregon, are there things going on that the local communities don't know about or are poorly informed about? You bet. And what's the impact of that? People don't engage. They can't hold public officials accountable. They can't question how their kids are being schooled or how the police are doing their work. So I think part of the solution in Oregon is to figure out what is the news that people want, and how do we, as a collective profession, find a new way to deliver that information?
Here's another journalist I'm introducing you to, Lee Vandervoo. She's a journalist who's worked for digital newsrooms for the last 15 years and is respected by print journalists across Oregon. She believes she and her business partner have figured out a way to deliver that digital news. In 2025, they plan to launch a digital nonprofit newsroom focused on the Columbia River Gorge. It'll be called Uplift Local. They will send it out in part through text messages.
I think that when nonprofit digital newsrooms started to develop in 2009, 2010, it was a lot of upstart folks who were recognizing the decline of the traditional newsroom and just kicking the tires on new things and trying to see what would work. I think now nonprofit newsrooms really are more targeted. They're either serving specific demographics or geographies or filling particular subject matter gaps. I think generally they're there to close longstanding, sometimes emerging news gaps, and to just fill in the blanks where local newsrooms may have declined.
Okay. And what about your guys' effort? What is that going to be focused on?
Yeah, at Uplift Local, we are focused on addressing news gaps in Oregon. We're providing new digital tools and services in areas that don't have local news, either because they've been underserved to begin with or are now. We've done a lot of research in Oregon. We've talked to 3,500 individuals in 4 different languages, and we've identified news gaps to be rural areas that don't have local news or sufficient local news, people who prefer to receive news and information in a language other than English, and culturally distinct communities who may not be getting relevant news.
So a lot of work being done there. Vandervoo adds that the digital nonprofits are typically tiny compared to traditional newsrooms. She points to operations like the Lund Report, which specializes in health news for Oregon and Southwest Washington. Also Investigate West, which she worked at, and it focuses on communities throughout the Northwest and focuses on the environment, government, and corporate accountability and more. Now, while some of the nonprofit newsrooms work alone, Nigel Jaquist says the Oregon Journalism Project is going to expand its reach by working with other newsrooms and taking Willamette Week's approach to watchdog journalism statewide.
The owner of Willamette Week, the longtime editor, Mark Zussman, has been spending a lot of time with other publications around the state. I think he's got 18 papers that are excited about running stories from the Oregon Journalism Project. So our goal, Pat, is to look for the kind of stories around the state outside the metro area that Willamette Week has done for decades, and to try and publish those with local partners, to sometimes work with local reporters when appropriate, and to try and shine a light on things that are happening in different parts of Oregon that are not getting covered right now.
So that's pretty exciting. However, there's a lot going on, but then there's the question of funding. These things run through subscriptions and donations. So is there enough money in the philanthropy world to keep them all going? Les Zeitz worries that the nonprofit field for journalism in Oregon is getting crowded. He has a keen interest in the issue. Besides owning the Malheur paper, he also runs the Oregon Capital Chronicle. That's a nonprofit news operation based in Salem that focuses on state government and politics.
Well, look, any initiative to try and rebuild journalism in Oregon is a good initiative. My concern is that we've got like 3 different projects underway in Oregon under different nonprofits that all seem to be sort of aiming at the same thing of trying to fill in news gaps around the state. And I just worry that in a small state with not a lot of donors, that the efforts are going to be spread too thin and the results are going to be too inadequate for what we need to do in Oregon.
So something to keep in mind. Lee Vandervoo with Uplift Local, though, believes there is plenty of donor money to go around and that interest is growing nationwide.
In the last year, we've seen institutional philanthropies around the country who have had an interest in journalism really mobilize around this issue of local news gaps. There's a lot more of an understanding that when people don't get local news and information, it really seeds and feeds disinformation, misinformation, polarizing narratives, and it is having a huge effect on civic participation and people's ability to like engage meaningfully in the systems that affect their lives every day. So we've seen folks who are interested in putting funds in journalism put together $500 million to strengthen local newsrooms, close longstanding gaps, and advance public policy that benefits people who want to access local news, and make those investments pretty deliberately in this space. That's very new. We've also seen 25 chapters of that effort called Press Forward stand up local efforts in communities around the country that are adding hundreds of millions of dollars to that pool specifically for local news. So there's tons of new resources in the space. And in Oregon, we do not have a local chapter yet, but we certainly have a lot of new interest in philanthropy, in news, and in the polarizing and the polarizing narratives in the misinformation that are taking the space of what civic discourse used to be when we had more local news.
Now, I know that was a deep dive on nonprofit news organizations, but I thought it was fascinating to learn about how the approach to news is changing, and I wanted to bring you along on the journey. Now, it's your turn. What do you think about all that? I know you like news, or you wouldn't be watching this live or later on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Are you aware of these nonprofit sites that I mentioned in the story? Would you be interested in contributing to one or more of the organizations? I'm not fundraising. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Send us your thoughts. The email address is thestory@kgw.com, or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. I look forward to hearing from you. Coming up next on The Story, a follow-up to the Oregon DMV debacle, where this week we learned more than 1,200 people were mistakenly registered to vote when in fact they were not eligible. Only 9 of those people, turns out, actually voted, but the DMV's statement on how exactly it all happened is downright ridiculous, we think. I'll give you my opinion on the fallout when The Story returns. Tomorrow, just before noon, an Oregon Legislative Committee will hold a hearing in Salem to try and figure out what went wrong and what led to 1,259 people being registered to vote in Oregon when, in fact, they were not eligible. It is a rare snafu in Oregon voting that has given oxygen to those who would like to spread doubt about election integrity here and elsewhere. Now, in case you missed it, about a week and a half ago, the Oregon Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV, was asked by an outside group how the automatic registration of voters was going. In Oregon, if you are a U.S. citizen and you get a new driver's license or you renew your license, you're automatically registered to vote. The DMV ran a review of their system and September 13th announced, whoops, they'd found some problems. 306 people registered as voters who were not citizens. Then yesterday, the agency announced the number had actually grown to 1,259 people. The Secretary of State's office was quick to point out that only 9 of that group actually voted in earlier elections. The entire group had its eligibility canceled and have been removed from the voter rolls, although as they check it out, some may be put back on. Okay, so then comes the strange part. Yesterday, the Secretary of State's office, which runs elections, and the DMV put out statements. Here is the release touting that only 9 people who were not supposed to vote actually did. The big question is what specifically went wrong and what's being done to fix it, which is why this part of the release is weird to me anyway. Under the heading of how the error occurred, it states DMV identified possible, though unlikely, causes for error. And then it goes on to give an explanation and an example of a DMV employee inadvertently checking a U.S. passport box when in fact someone had a foreign passport. I have to tell you that possible, though unlikely, that line drives me crazy. Okay, so that's the facts. Here's my opinion now on what all that means. Whoever wrote that line for the DMV or allowed it to go out in the press release, that person should be fired. Are you kidding me? DMV identified possible, though unlikely, causes for the error? Who thinks that makes a shred of sense? Why don't you just say, yeah, we have no idea what happened? I mean, come on. Did the DMV identify the cause for the error or not? Because in the frequently asked questions section of the release yesterday, which I doubt most people read, they give the example of the U.S. passport, foreign passport mix-up, but they call it rare. And I would argue that rare is not the same as unlikely, especially in this polarizing political environment. In my mind, unlikely means we don't think that happened, but we'll say that it could have. Rare means, yeah, it did happen, but not very often. The communication from the agency is as clear as mud, in my opinion. So, are all of these mistakenly registered voters just due to an employee error in checking a box in their system? It kind of does sound like that's the case. 15 minutes into the news conference yesterday, leaders said that after reviewing all the data, the checking of a U.S. passport when it was actually a foreign passport is the crux of the problem. So why not say that in the press release? And by the way, how did they identify those 1,200 names? Did they go in and search for everyone who had used a foreign passport to get a license and then check to see if they were registered to vote and say, whoops? I think that's possible, but the agency's tortured explanation did not make that clear at all. I emailed them today with that question, and guess what? They did not answer. And you might think that I'm making a mountain of a hole here. Can't even say that right, but I disagree, and here's why. First, I think that Oregon has excellent election security and that the system runs with security, integrity, and efficiency all over the state, thanks to the hard work of county clerks and election workers. Registering 1,200 people to vote who are not eligible is a black eye to the reputation of that system, even though the number represents a very small percentage of the overall registered voters. But on top of that, a clumsy and confusing explanation of what happened just makes the whole situation so much worse. Somewhere tonight, there are people telling each other about this snafu and using it as one more data point to convince each other in their fevered brains that the election system in Oregon is rigged. It's not. But the DMV's explanation on this is certainly not helping with that argument. That's my opinion anyway, and you don't have to agree with me. But it would be nice if you communicated. So, what do you think? Am I out of line, or does the DMV need to do much better to explain this? Let me know, will you? The email address is thestory@kgw.com, or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. In the meantime, keep it right here. We're back with some of your comments on last night's big story right after this. Now let's get to some of your thoughts on our big story from last night. Governor Kotek preparing to use her temporary land use superpowers and bring nearly 400 acres into the urban growth boundary near Hillsborough. In my opinion, it seems clear that it's meant to attract a new semiconductor innovation hub known as Extreme Ultraviolet Center. The thought is that the center would utilize Intel's one-of-a-kind lithography machine, which I profiled earlier this year. It's a fascinating machine that costs around $380 million. You can check out my story on the KGW YouTube channel to learn more about it. Now, as we told you last night, Kotek only has this rare power through the end of the year, thanks to Senate Bill 4 that passed during the last 2023 legislative session. And it's the state's version of the CHIPS Act. You've heard of the federal, this is the state version. It's meant to go along with the federal CHIPS Act that's pouring billions into the effort to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the good old US of A. But much like when we followed Senate Bill 4 through the legislature, many of you are not thrilled about the urban growth boundary changes.
Urban growth boundary, my sweet Bippy. It isn't a boundary if you keep pushing it out and making exceptions. Whatever you want to do with the land, make do with the land inside the boundary. It's disgusting the way they keep nibbling away at what should be outside the boundary. It isn't a boundary if you don't respect the boundary. It's just an obstruction in the ever-growing expansion of crap.
Okay, thanks for that comment. Aaron wrote to us to say, I am a small farmer just north of the proposed expansion area and am one of the organizers working against this expansion. It's very unclear that the governor has the power to actually designate this land. He went on, we, Farmland First and 1,000 Friends of Oregon have engaged a top land use attorney in Oregon, and we believe there will be multiple causes of action should the governor attempt to use her powers. While it is very important that the residents of Oregon know what is going on, this deal is far from a sure thing. Thank you for your comment. But some of you think attempts to stop the expansion are just delaying the inevitable. A viewer on our YouTube channel wrote, that farmland will fall to development sooner or later. They are just fighting to hold back the tide, possibly passing up major opportunities for high-tech jobs while our home prices and property taxes are sky high due to the urban growth boundary makes no sense. And Don wrote to us last night to say, I support the governor making the exception here as the good to Oregon far outweighs whatever might be grown on that land forever. The landowner's desire to sell, so 1,000 Friends of Oregon are fully on the wrong side of logic here. And by the way, last night I reported that the landowners there are indeed interested and willing to sell. That's according to the Hillsborough Economic and Community Development Director, who says this proposal includes multiple landowners and several are working with the city. So take that for what it's worth. Remember, the public meeting over this chunk of land being absorbed into the urban growth boundary is just over 2 weeks away. It's October 10th at the Hillsborough Civic Center at 6 p.m. After that meeting, the governor has to take comments for 20 days before making a final decision. And before we go tonight, you know, we cover a lot of serious topics on this show. Much of them pass through the state's capital in Salem. Sometimes lawmakers take up issues that are, let's say, not quite as pressing. And that includes Senate Concurrent Resolution 3, passed during the 2023 legislative session. It designates the potato as Oregon's official state vegetable. Congratulations, potato. This week, an induction ceremony was held to celebrate, including a plaque and all. The Oregon Potato Commission hosted the event, and yes, that is a real, legitimate organization. It's big money. Spuds rake in $200 million annually, and Oregon ranks 4th in the nation for tater production. Idaho, Washington, and Wisconsin round out the top 3 tuber growers. Learning stuff all the time. Hey, that's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching. But remember the story, our collective story, that never ends. For those of you watching online, we'll see you next time, however you find us. For the rest of you watching live, the good stuff's coming your way next, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow night at 6:30. Good night.